Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of America in Black and White, where we discuss the issues that plague our communities and we try to solve them as best as we can. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Todd Shaw, who is a CAS Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. He teaches and researches on the topics of American politics, African American politics, U.S. racial and ethnic politics, public policy, and political participation. He has published numerous scholarly articles and one of his recent books as an edited volume, After Obama, African American Politics in Post Obama America. He has served as an associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at USC and has a past resident of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, among other professional honors. He is always delighted to engage with fellow citizens on issues of public concern. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Todd Shaw.
Well, hello.
Hey, how are you?
Doing fine. How are you doing, good sir?
I'm doing just excellent. Thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you loaning us your expertise for today.
Sure. Happy to be a part of this August broadcast.
Is there anything you'd like to add to your bio?
No, I think you covered the grounds. You said my roots are in India, or did I? I don't know if I included in my official bio, but I'm a native Hoosier, born and raised in Indiana. I don't know exactly what a Hoosier is, but that's what we're called. And but spent some time in Indiana, spent some time in Morristown, New Jersey, when my dad moved out there and moved our family out there. And then also, of course, spent some time in DC at Howard University and Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I bounced around, now being in the deep South, South Carolina. I think South Carolina is the deep South.
Yes, sir. Well, we definitely appreciate it. And we can let us get started here. And we're going to talk about, some of the things about your background here in academia. What inspired you to pursue a career in political science and African American studies?
Well, I had some outstanding mentors at Howard University. In fact, I am the mascot of Howard University is the bison. So we proud bison are a tight knit group, so much so that I am now the president of the Greater Columbia chapter of the Alumni Club, the Howard University Alumni Club. But my mentors at Howard, particularly individuals like Linda Williams, these are faculty mentors, Linda Williams, Ronald Walters, Joseph McCormick. Those are some of the folk who I took classes with, who I was really inspired by their example. And they taught the subject, among other subjects, they taught the subject of African American politics. And African American politics is a cross section between African American studies and political science. And so taking their courses like the political philosophy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, or African American, or what we will call Black politics, or Afro American politics, or courses on African American political thought and history. So taking those types of courses from them, I was inspired to think about political science and African American studies at the same time. And in fact, at Howard, I was part of the Howard University government. It's called HUSA, the Howard University Student Association. With HUSA, I served as in one of the cabinets of the first two women to become HUSA president and vice president, and Ona Alston and Yvonne Brooks. And they asked me, as the director of research, they tasked me to help pass an initiative that student government was behind, which is to have African American studies be a course in African American studies to be a required course at Howard University for students in the College of Liberal Arts. And we eventually got that passed as a requirement. So I was always sort of thinking about African American studies a lot, as well as political science, and the ways my mentors, as well as my student peer leaders, inspired me to think about both fields.
Oh wow. That's pretty cool. So like just in that whole process, I mean, like were there like a lot of advocacy for the students as far as like just different African American studies and courses that they were supposedly presenting at Howard?
Yes, yes. Howard University has this long history of Black scholarships and Black intellectual contributions. But it also has this interesting history of Howard kind of represents the genius as well as some of the intellectual battles in Black America. And one of those battles was the establishment of Black studies. Now, Howard is among the largest, among the most prestigious and well endowed of our HBCUs. In fact, my fellow HBCU folk are probably, get a little miffed at us or mad at us because we call ourselves the Mecca of Black education. Now, Morehouse and Spelman and Hampton might think differently of that title, but that's the title we use for ourselves. Well, Howard would have been a natural place for the discipline of Black studies, the first department of Black studies or African American studies to be founded, but it wasn't. Dr. Nathan Hare and Julia Hare were at Howard, but sort of got upset with the administration and the administration at that time in the late 60s. And were not retained as faculty members. So they went out to San Francisco State University to found the first Black Studies program. But shortly thereafter, African American Studies was founded at Howard and many other institutions, including the one I'm at now, the University of South Carolina. But the student activism of that day and the student activism of my day, about 20 or so years later, all were around this idea of should we teach a Black education, and should we educate Black students in their history, in their culture, in the legacy of leadership and in grassroots activism. And so our answer was yes. And so students at Howard have been militating for a Black education, a Black-centered education for quite some time. And I'm part of that legacy of students militating for such an education.
Can you share some key milestones in your academic journey?
Well, I would say Howard University is one of those milestones. I don't think I would be the person I am today without Howard. To go to an institution where you are definitely not the minority. In fact, I got a global education at Howard because I had students who were from Jamaica, from Ghana, students from across the African diaspora in my classes. And, we could have a debate about South African politics with students from South Africa, for students who were from or had roots in South Africa as Black people in South Africa. So, it's not, you weren't learning about individuals, we weren't learning about Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was coming to speak at our campus. We weren't learning about Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan would speak at the campus, or sort of just a number of illustrious individuals who came through Howard. And so Howard was quite an education for me, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. Another milestone was my mentor, Linda Williams, hired me at a place called the Joint Center for Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Joint Center was the first Black think tank dedicated to politics in Washington, D.C. And I got hired there as an undergraduate working with Dr. Linda Williams, who had an appointment at Howard University. And Linda then took me to a conference called the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And that was back in about 1987. Back in 1987, that conference is at Chicago. And the keynote speaker at that conference was the first Black mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington. So to be at a conference with the Harold Washington, who is one of my personal heroes in Black political history for what he did in becoming the first mayor of the city of Chicago. But Linda introduced me to that professional association, INCOPS is the short name, National Council of Black Political Scientists, INCOPS. Little did I know, about 30 years later, I would become a president of INCOPS. So she introduced me to the organization in 1987, and then around about 2015, I became a president. I think I was the 41st president. I'm not remembering, but the 41st president of that organization. So those are some of the milestones. And then certainly getting my PhD from the University of Michigan. I had two brilliant people, Michael Dawson, as well as Haynes Walton, the two of the most published and well-known scholars in my field of African-American politics and political science. So those milestones just, are among those things. And, and I've been just really kind of blessed, my brother, and throughout my career, now that I'm at the University of South Carolina, certainly getting a job here and getting tenure here and being a distinguished professor here is a milestone.
Oh, wow. So how was your role as an associate professor evolved over the years?
Well, to be an associate professor is to be, or to be a tenured professor is to be among what we call the senior faculty of a department. Senior in the sense that you have tenure, you are more senior in your career, and some of the responsibilities you take on is to mentor your more junior colleagues who not yet attained tenure, to serve in various capacities in the department. So I've served as an interim chair as well as the chair of the Department of Political Science, and to this date, I'm the first and only African American to be the department chair at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. But among your sort of key responsibilities at a research institution is continue to publish and to become a nationally and internationally known scholar in your field. And I've certainly tried throughout my career to live up to that important standard. So those are some of the responsibilities. Also just I'd consider, and it is a responsibility to engage with the community, to be of service to the community, because we are a public institution. And so things like this, Brother Charles, getting out and talking with fellow citizens are also part of my responsibility as a political scientist and as a member of the faculty at University of South Carolina.
So what are some of the most rewarding aspects of teaching and researching African American politics?
Well, over my desk, I used to hang a quote from the President Franklin Roosevelt, and I'll paraphrase the quote because I moved offices and I forgot where I put it, but the quote kind of goes along the lines of that to teach young people is it's not that you get to determine the future, but you get to shape the careers and lives of those who do determine the future, right? And so there's a certain satisfaction in being a teacher in that you touch upon the future. Among the most rewarding things for me of teaching is mentoring, is having sort of a one-to-one relationship with my students where I can help to guide their careers, give them great, advice about their careers, give them advice and recommendations that may help them, later on in their education or in their careers. But I also do enjoy the classroom engagement, getting it, I'll share my knowledge with the students, but then to hear their thoughts as young people. And it kind of keeps me young, at least in some small respect, to be talking to 18 and 19-year-olds. Not always I agree with them, and sometimes I gotta coax it out of them and to say, put down that cell phone and talk. But which is sometimes a challenge. But to kind of see what they're thinking, because it's refreshing, sometimes frustrating, but refreshing to know what do they think about the world, what do they think about the politics of the day, and what do we think that we stand in this nation, in the world? So those are some of the certainly rewarding features of being a teacher, particularly at the college level.
So, how do you balance your responsibilities between the Department of Political Science and the African American Studies program?
That is a very good question, and when I have the good answer to that question, we can come back and I'll tell you. Um, it's not easy having what's called a joint appointment. So I'm jointly appointed. My tenure home, as we call this, is in political science. So that's the department, and tenure is simply that you essentially have a job until you retire. And they find you as a scholar so noteworthy that that rather than go out and hire someone else and let you go, they give you a job for life, and it's a high privilege. Tenure is a high privilege. We as academics, we do it so routinely we might forget that very few people are guaranteed a job for life. So I'm tenured in political science, but African American studies is very much a home for me. It's I would say in some way it's equally a home for me, given what I do. And in some ways, you have to have department chairs that understand what you do, that are willing to, and I do, that are willing to collaborate with each other and say, okay, well, Todd will teach this course this semester for me. Why don't he teach this course next semester for you? And so you kind of have to do that. There's also Todd is serving on this committee over here for us. Well, but this next semester he'll serve on this committee for you. So you have to have a lot of negotiation to do that well. And both units highly respect me as their colleague and as a scholar, and so we get along pretty well. I'll say now that I'm served in the role of chair of the political science department, so I have some insights, along with serving as an associate dean. I have some insights I can offer both units. Right now, I have some responsibilities in political science, but over in African American Studies, I'm serving as a vice chair. So there's always something where I'm kind of, trying to negotiate between the two units, but both are important to me given what I do.
So, as you say, with this being a research institution, how does that jog when it comes to working with, well, how does that apply to your students as well as the community? How do you apply the two?
Yeah, so it's for me, it's seamless. I can't talk about African American politics and U.S. racial and ethnic politics without African American studies, because though that is a discipline, among other things, that centers the Black experience and centers how race matters. But without politics, without political scientists, I am a student of politics. So I look at many of the things that happen in life through a lens of political analysis. And I would be talking about and being a nerd about politics, even if it wasn't my profession. So when I'm going out into the community, I'm hopefully I'm serving as a good ambassador for both units. And I often insist it's a long title, but my full title at the university is the Cass Distinguished Professor of Political Science and African American Studies. And I try to always remind reporters I have both titles, not just one, because it's sort of central to what I do. Now, but let me remember the element of the question, Charles. Were you saying in terms of serving students? Let me make sure I'm answering your question.
Yes.
How to serve students? Yeah. So my courses are often cross-listed, so I'll have students who are in political science or in African American studies taking my courses, and they're getting the same material from both sides. I encourage students who are in political science to, if they're really interested, to either do a double major or a minor in African American studies. And my African American studies majors, they're fewer in number, but I might also encourage them to say, well, if you're really interested in politics, you might do a minor in political science. So I kind of encourage students to explore both areas. And these days, more and more students want sort of creative major and minor options, not just sort of the cookie cutter, oh, either you either you are or are not studying all in sociology, but the students are interested in blended knowledge, if you will, and because it makes them more attractive on the job market to say they have experience in more than one field. And it's just more intriguing to them. I'm finding a lot of students are doing, again, either majors or double majors in areas because they don't see themselves as sort of all in one silo or one box.
Mm. So, can you discuss your experience as the interim chair and chair of the Department of Political Science?
So, being appointed, well, I was elected by my colleagues in political science and then appointed by the dean. That's how it happens in colleges, is that the faculty give an advisory vote to the dean, but it's the dean's recommendation. The dean decides who's appointed and serves as department chairs. So, I thought it was a great honor. And I enjoyed my time as chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of South Carolina. Department chair also has its challenges because departments are big, they're complex, you have many constituencies, so there's always challenges, and you take those challenges on, and hopefully you feel, and hopefully I feel I did good in that. I helped and served the department well, because you don't want to be a chair and feel like you haven't served the department. What's the point if you haven't served your colleagues and students and staff in good ways? But I found it to be an invaluable experience. In fact, there are various times when I refer back to that experience when I'm giving others advice, because I can say, well, when I served as department chair, here's what I think is really important to your colleagues as faculty members. Or if students going on the job market, here's what a department chair might say. And it kind of gives me a genuine insight about how the department is run. So I can be, a better mentor to my junior colleagues when they say, well, do you know exactly how this process goes? So, well, I may not have the experience of being the chair, because we had another colleague serve as chair over a number of years after I left that appointment was it 2019 or so? But I think I have that right. But but I can give them some advice, because there's some things about departments that don't immediately change. And so it was an invaluable experience. I had the experience of hiring, when I was department chair, 7 members of the faculty were hired. And so I walked through that process. Now, I cannot take credit for all those 7 people. It was a team effort of my colleagues sort of doing the hard work of searching through files, setting up interviews, etc. But I helped to, as department chair, it is my job to seal the deal, because I can't flub it once all that hard work is done by my colleagues. So I'm the one who negotiates with the candidate and the dean to secure them to be here. And I had the experience of retaining some of my colleagues who got offers elsewhere. But I was at least modestly successful, at least 50-50 successful in retaining some colleagues who are great scholars and great teachers. And then there was sort of I've had been able to be successful in mentoring junior colleagues. So there's all these things that I think I was able to do, and I think I'm a better faculty member having served as chair.
Hmm. What motivated you to write "Now Is the Time: Detroit Black Politics and Grassroots Activism"?
That book stems from my dissertation work at the University of Michigan. And that's what you might say is the highly revised version of my dissertation. But it was highly revised because that book was about somewhere between 200 and 250 pages, double spaced, before it became a book. Now, but brace yourself, Charles. That book was roughly 200 pages. My dissertation, however, was 500 pages.
Oh, wow.
Right. So, and I would never advise a student to write a 500-page dissertation. And I don't regret I wrote that, but you can only imagine I had a lot of revisions to do in
So you
order
have a lot to say too,
narrow
huh?
this down. Exactly. So, but the book asks a simple question, which is, you know, we often think about this idea of protest. Well, what good is protest? What does protest accomplish? And what I wanted to do, thinking about the Black experience, is to say, um, well, when might protest be effective? Because we can't presume that every tool is fit for every job. And
Mm.
so in that book, I say, well, there's three broad factors. And I read broadly across the literature, particularly literature in sociology and social movements. And I said, well, there's three broad considerations I want to kind of think about in thinking about Detroit politics and grassroots activism as an important case, which is timing. Protest, is it the right tool at the right time in the right place? So timing, utility, and context. And so I came up with a theoretical model, we call it, a fancy word for how it all fits together. And I think what I accomplished in that book is to sort of say that there are times when protests will be more effective, particularly times of when political systems in transition or leaders are more vulnerable to mobilization. And there are times when this activism can also produce results. So there are opportunities for it to produce results. And then you have to talk about, well, if you're talking about the election of a candidate, then you have to use the protest tool of the vote. If you're talking about resisting and legally challenging a particular law, then you have to talk about the protest tool of the case, of the brief. If you're talking about a business, or governmental entity who you want to oppose and raise sand about what they're doing, then you're talking about protest or demonstration. So you kind of have to match the right tool of activism to the right outcome. And that's what I try to accomplish in that book, looking at Detroit roughly from the years of 1930 to about early 2000s, and Black activism over that period.
Mm. How did you develop the effective Black activism model, the EBAM?
Yeah, as I led on, I developed that model looking at and reading pretty deeply the literature in social movements, particularly a particular model called the political opportunities model, that says there's got to be certain conditions to be present for protest to be the most effective. Like, I'll give you an example. The reason why protest was more effective with the civil rights movement in the early in the 1950s and 1960s, as opposed to the early turn of the century, is because of several conditions. One of them was that in some ways the federal government was a reluctant ally to Black leaders and movements. The Kennedy administration, to a lesser degree the Eisenhower administration, but they had sort of pressures, sometimes political and electoral pressures, to observe the rights and to some degree protect the rights of Black protesters. So the Kennedy administration was kind of pulled into the fight when Martin Luther King was jailed in the Birmingham jail. Kennedy famously made a plea about the release of King, partly because he was thinking about the Black vote and the Black vote he needed to be elected president, right? So the federal government was a reluctant ally. Then the activists had networks and resources at a time in greater numbers in that period of the 50s and 60s than was true of the turn of the century. And so, and it was a slow build up, but they began to develop the tactic of direct action at a sensitive time in American history, at a time when there was this whole discussion about, well, isn't America the land of the free and home of the brave? Isn't it a beacon of freedom against communist Russia and the Eastern Bloc? Well, you can't say you are the great entity of democracy if folk are catching hell being beat into the inch of their lives in the South. And so so the activists had on their side this sense of, well, are you really a democracy? Okay, then why are you letting the South deny African Americans their rights and their citizenship rights to the vote? So there were a lot of ways in which activists saw this particular time of the 1950s after a war period. And funny enough, periods after wars are often periods when activism comes into play, because veterans come back and say, hey, I just fought for democracy, like black veterans after World War II. I just fought for democracy, over in Italy and France and Germany. But you mean I can't be a full citizen in Mississippi?
Mm.
So all of those things kind of came to the forefront, and I used that knowledge from the civil rights movement and other protest movements to say, okay, let me apply this to local activism in a city such as Detroit.
Wow. So how much research did you have to do in order to write that? Because as you speak and you mention the detail of how you went through to come up with these concepts of what should be used when and how it should be used, means like, is there like, um what were what was the meaning, the pure meaning of what you were actually trying to put out as far as the system that you came up with? What was the pure meaning?
So the whole purpose of it was to say, when how is black grassroots or when is black grassroots activism effective? When is black grassroots activism effective? That was the whole point of the model. The broader model is when is grassroots activism effective? So the difference between the EAM and the EBAM is the black part. And I got the idea of the EAM for the broader literature, and then modified aspects of it for the black experience. So that was the point. And I assure you, Charles, it took a long time. I stayed in graduate school number of years, but I built up this knowledge, over that period, and then used my study, and I got a fellowship from the Ford, or postdoctoral fellowship from the Ford Foundation. And I went back after I was at the University of Michigan for my dissertation. I was then hired at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. But while at Urbana-Champaign, I got a postdoctoral fellowship, went back to Detroit for a year, went through these archives, gathered other sources of data and stuff that I didn't get a chance to do as a doctoral student. And that's where it all came to play. And so probably the book, the book itself, oh yeah, the book itself took me about 7 years all total, about 7 years by the time I got it all together. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the challenges you faced in your academic career, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I think sometimes, and I'll speak to this directly as as an African American scholar. Sometimes, throughout my career and throughout all of our careers, we have to, and I'm speaking as sort of a black scholar, as a black intellectual, we have to confront the imposter syndrome. So, I'm in a discipline that has greatly, political science, I should say. Political science is a discipline, has improved in terms of the number of African Americans or blacks, I should use globally speaking, black people who have attained their degrees and gone on to got their masters and their doctorates in political science. It has improved, but we're still a smaller number than we should be. True for most of the departments I've served in. More often than not, I was one or maybe one of three, or one of two or three members of the faculty who were black. And so one of those challenges of the quote unquote imposter syndrome is to say, I've studied something that most of my colleagues, they may highly regard, but it's not an expertise they have. So I have to translate, and I don't have to translate, fortunately things have improved. So I don't have to translate much, but I do have to translate aspects of what I'm doing to my colleagues to say, here's not only, what I'm doing but where I'm publishing what I do, right? Because they have to evaluate me, either annual reviews or reviews for promotion, to say, is Todd doing what Todd doing good? And so, as Black scholars, there's times in which we say, well, we have to know the mainline stuff and our stuff too, and be good at both, and I'm not pointing any fingers to say, this the old syndrome of be twice as good to be just as good, right? And that's even when your colleagues, are very, are good folk who are very sympathetic, do appreciate what you do. So sometimes the imposter syndrome of I'm serving, I'm having to speak to the mainline discipline published in the credible and highly regarded and reputable journals there, but do my stuff within my own subfield of African American politics as well. I have to be a good teacher and mentor overall, but then there can be, symbolically speaking, a long line of students, particularly Black students and students of color, who want to work with me, because I am and sort of seek to be a good mentor. So the imposter syndrome is saying sometimes ends up being, can I do all this well? Should I expect to do all of this well? Am I doing this right? Am I, in my discipline of political science, we are highly numbers driven. We're very quantitative, and me dusting off my own brain sometimes to say, did I run this model correctly? I'm working on a current book project, and I've been working on some models at the end of the book for 3 months, and like, and are they right? Are these numbers adding up, properly? So all of those things going on makes you, as a Black scholar, sometimes question, not the sense of self, but question, okay, am I doing this right? Am I being appreciated for what I try to do? Should I pull back and try and do all of this? That's how the imposter syndrome can kind of show up.
How has your research on African American politics and urban politics influenced your teaching methods?
Well, I don't. I lecture in my undergraduate classes. I lecture some in my graduate classes, but I hate a class, and maybe that's strong, but I'll say it. I hate a class where I'm the only one speaking.
Wow.
It would bug me to no ends if, in fact, through the entire semester, my voice is the voice that people hear. That's not education, in my view. Now, and that's not education. That's recitation and regurgitation. Education is when I click on a light comes on, a spark is lit, and students start talking and having conversations, and all I have to do is step back. That's a good class in my view. That I've pulled them away enough from social media. They're not staring down at their laptop or their device doing games, but they're actually drawn into a conversation and actually say, this is interesting, and I'm interested enough in this to have a conversation with my fellow classmates. That's becoming increasingly difficult these days. Generation Z has a lot of strengths and positive attributes, but it is the generation who has only known social media. They've only known a life with the internet. They have only known life where there was no such thing as mainline broadcast TV news as your main source of news. So they, and they are the generation of the pandemic, right? And where they spent part of their high school years or formative high school years, and now some of their college years or in some cases, their college years, during or at least shortly after the pandemic. So their attention span is different in a lot of ways. And this is showing up in ways that are challenging folks like me who are now almost 60. I might as well say I'm 60 years old, to try and appeal to an 18-year-old and draw them in, have them think, have them debate, have them take a side, or at least understand, to inform their own view, and to really take a stake, and not just say, either I'll sit there passively and kind of listen, or I'll just take notes. No, I want to draw them in and have them consider themselves learner in this process, or co-learners in the process. And that's a bit of a challenge these days.
So, do you think, because they are such about this social media era, they're about these phones and anything that's dealing with technology, that it pretty much just takes everything right here? How does that affect them when it comes to, let's say, putting them in a situation where they got to critically think? Have you seen any of that where it's not as effective as it should be?
Yes, I have. There was a recent article, and I'm trying to remember if it was from the Washington Post or where, but there was this whole discussion about employers firing a whole bunch of folk who are Gen Z, and even millennials firing Gen Z. And some of it is that Gen Z is this most immediate generation who are young adults, but were not socialized in the very social cues of being young adults. And that doesn't mean Gen Z is just running wild, because they have passion, they have brilliance, they have creativity, they have all these things. But because they have spent so much time online with social media, with they'll be sitting right next to each other, texting each other, or doing Instagram. They're drawn away from, as opposed to in person. So putting the device away, finding meaningful connection is the difficult thing with Gen Z, because they just, I'm not surprised that they go out into the workforce and something as simple as, well, is this attire appropriate for the workforce? I'm not surprised that they kind of like skip that, or don't do as well in thinking through that, because they've been sitting in front of a camera part of their high school years sometimes with the camera off, sitting in their pajamas and floppy slippers, right? So they're like, well, we haven't interacted, they haven't had extensive interaction in person. And so to me, that doesn't make them uneducable or unintelligent. Far from it, and not at all. But it does mean that we're having to think through some dynamics of that in-person contact, that's those social connections that haven't been true for other generations. And so it's just a little harder for them to not be drawn into those devices and to social media. I mean, heck, I keep my device. I'm an old person, and I keep my device around me a lot. So I can't imagine what's true for an 18 or 19-year-old. And so it's just a challenge as educators. Sometimes I don't go against the trend. Sometimes I say, well, since you're already on your device, let me ask you to Google the following, so we can look this up as a class and think through this. Yeah. So sometimes you got to lean in, rather than always tell them, always chide them for being non-social.
So, with that being said, though, what do you think are what would be some of the things that you think could help to kind of like ease that and change that a little bit? What are some of the things that you recommend? If it's not just parents, but what you guys do, like in the university environment, to help change that?
I think we ought to use the technology in creative ways, so that we're not always chiding them about what they don't know, what they don't do. They have a strong skill set. They can look stuff up and find stuff quicker than us 60 and 70-year-olds.
Right.
And so that skill set's an invaluable skill set in what is clearly an information age in which we live in. So you letting them use that skill set for good purpose, and to show them how to use it. Like, for instance, we've had this discussion over the last 2 years, and it's only going to grow, about artificial intelligence and AI. And, the whole question around, hey, can we, in what ways can we just ban AI so that they're not dependent on the AI to write term papers, to write essays, et cetera, et cetera. I've resisted that. I've resisted because students, all of us need to know how to write. We need to know how to, and I teach political science. So the vast majority of my students want to go on to law school. Lawyers need to know how to write and communicate. So we can't punt on the old idea of being critical, analytical, and being able to express yourself in written form, along with, of course, spoken form. So what I do is I don't ban AI from my classroom. I tell them the parameters of when they can use it. And I design assignments where AI is not particularly helpful. If I'm saying, write an essay based on Dr. Shaw's lecture comments from this lecture, you can't go up to ChatGPT and say, not yet. What did Dr. Shaw say? It'll say, well, I don't know. I wasn't in the class, So you can design assignments that are tailored to, actually, I should write that one down, Charles. But you can design assignments that such that you can draw them in and have them have to make use of their human capacity. But then you can also show them, okay, you're doing a term paper. I want you to, while you're in class, look up the following, look up sites using citations or references for your paper using ChatGPT. So you can show them how to use it in ways that actually are helpful, that actually are good shortcuts, that aren't cheating, that aren't plagiarizing, aren't just saying, okay, write me a term paper on. Because I can, it's going to get good so that we can't tell. But for now, I think I and many of my colleagues have been able to determine, like, this is just a little too plastic and well put together. There are certain quirks of writing as human beings that you won't find when it's true for a robot writing a paper. So, there's time. I mean, I've had instances where students wrote essays on a book where none of the characters that were in that book were in that paper. So I knew. I like, this is a really fascinating story. It has nothing to do with what we read, So there's ways in which we still can kind of get some hints. But we should lean in and think of ways to use the technology and use their skill set, not always fight them on it. We could even tell them, okay, you're going to an interview. Look up what is appropriate dress or appropriate greetings in an interview. I mean, so you can use the technology to actually have them lean in, not just sort of degrade them for the time they spend in social media and the internet and on the internet.
So let's move over to your research and publications. Can you tell us about your book, After Obama, African American Politics in a Post-Obama Era?
Yes, that book was co-edited by my very, very good friend, Robert Brown. So Dr. Robert Brown, who's at Spelman College in Atlanta, joined me on that book. And Rob and I were, anyone in political science or our friends in political science know that Rob and I are best buddies. So Rob and I, stemming all the way to going to graduate school at the University of Michigan. So Rob was a co-editor on that book. But then also one of my mentors from Howard University, Dr. Joseph McCormick, was on that book. And so we co-edited, we were the co-editors of that book. And we asked roughly about 13 other colleagues to come and write chapters on the premise that what did Barack Obama's presidency mean for Black people and for Black politics? And what legacy does he have after being president? And so from questions of Obama's policies with regards to economic policies and policies related to poverty, related to housing, related to healthcare. What did he do relative to the courting and politics of Black women, the politics of the Black LGBT community, the politics of young people, So there's a whole range of chapters, immigration, etc., who colleagues joined us on, and each of these colleagues wrote chapters, and then we edited the whole volume for New York University Press. But we thought that was important to talk about, do a critical but fair assessment of the Obama presidency relative to African Americans and African American politics.
So, did you do anything like a study to give you like some end results, or did you guys just come to a conclusion?
Well, so each chapter represents a separate study.
Okay.
So we, as the editors, wrote the introductory chapter where we kind of framed the whole volume,
Okay.
and we talked about Obama's the sense in which Obama had what was called a linked fate with the Black community, and in what sense did Obama in his presidency, at least an element of his presidency, was rooted in this idea of him being an African American, of him being Black. But then we also talked about the politics of the Black community linking our fates to Obama. And so that we did that framing in that first chapter. Then each scholar wrote a separate chapter where they pulled in data and studies that kind of linked to the broader theme. And then we wrote a concluding chapter where we talked about where do we go from here, given the Obama presidency. So we as the editors wrote bookends, and then all the other authors wrote chapters in between that were separate studies on the Obama presidency.
Okay. Is this still in circulation?
It is. It is. You can get it on Amazon, and you can up our royalty rate. I mean, you can get our you can take advantage of it.
What are the main themes explored in Uneven Roads, an introduction to U.S. racial and ethnic politics?
So that's a textbook that I in the last sort of 15 years of my career, roughly 15 years of my career, I've been very collaborative, working with other scholars, and we do a lot of that in political science now. That textbook, now in its third edition, is a textbook that talks about the U.S. racial and ethnic politics. And I was joined on that textbook by Dr. Louis DeCipio at UC Irvine, Dr. Diane Pender-Hughes at Notre Dame University of Notre Dame, Dr. Tony Michelle Travis, who's a retired faculty member from George Mason University, and Dr. Lori Frazier, who's at the University of UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. Lori was a student of Diane, Lewis, and I. And so I remember Lori as a freshman, and now she's a full professor at UCLA. So it was quite a privilege to have one of our former students now join us as a colleague on the volume. The simple that book has 13 chapters. The simple question, or the question that textbook answers, is when, why, and how does race matter when it comes to the citizenship rights and opportunities that various groups enjoy. And we try to do a comprehensive view of racial politics in America. We have a chapter on the African American political experience, the Native American political experience, the Asian American political experience, the white or European American political experience, and the Hispanic or Latino American political experience. That's the first part of the book, and we trace each group's history till about roughly 1970-ish. Then the second part of the book goes through political behavior, representation, political psychology, activism, public policy, education, criminal justice, and then we wrap it up in the concluding chapter. But the whole point of the book is to say when, why, and how race matters. And because Louis, Diane, and myself, and Tony and Lori, we've all taught that course on racial and ethnic politics, we all have had views about what a textbook should be like. So we wrote one. We said, well, we've been teaching this course. Now we know what we would want to see in a textbook. And that book has been well received, and we're happy about that.
Oh, wow. How do you approach interdisciplinary research in political science and African American studies?
Well, I'm a scholar of political science and African American studies. I'm a scholar of African American politics, but I'm very sociological in my political science. So I study, in Detroit, I study social movements, political movements, or grassroots activism, which is something sociologists think a lot about. Sociologists have been pioneering in the study of social movements like the civil rights movement, et cetera. So, that brings in a sort of sociology perspective. Now I'm working with two other scholars, Kirk Foster at the University of Texas, Arlington, and Barb Combs, who's at Kennesaw State University, on a book entitled Finding Home, the Diverse Communities, plural, of Black Politics. And in that book, we talk about, well, what is this notion of belonging in Black communities? Where are the places and spaces Black folk go to have important discussions, a sense of belonging, to work out our politics as we go out into the world to participate, to engage? And is it the neighborhood? Is it is it organizations in the churches? Is it social media? So, and particularly, we make it even a little more complex because we say Black communities, plural, meaning are Black women, is their pattern of connection in neighborhoods, in churches, or organizations and social media, is that the same pattern or a different pattern that's true for young Black people? So if I'm a political candidate and I say, well, I'm going to appeal to the Black community, when I go to the Black church, who might not be there, right? Well, young people might not be there, right? Young people are over off on social media, or they may be engaged in organizations. So if I'm really going to cover the gamut of the Black communities, how do I should I go to different venues, places, and spaces? Because that's where folk are. Are Black LGBTQ folk in neighborhoods? Are they have a sense of belonging in neighborhoods? Or really is it more organizations, which we're finding, coming together in organizations or social media, if you want to go talk with that segment of the Black community? So in other words, Charles, the simple proposition we're trying to answer is, if the Black community is not a monolith, and it is not, then how do we take that seriously and say, okay, well, where are the different places and spaces where Black people in a political sense have a sense of home? And that's what we're doing in that book.
Oh, wow. Now, that sounds like a real serious, big research project for today with today's times. What do you think?
It is. It is. It's taken us a while to get it all together, and I'm finally getting it together in these last several months of 2004 and into 2025, 2024, 2025. So it's been a project long in development, and some of it, Charles, is just that is the complexity of what we're trying to do. But we're trying to do something simple to start a conversation among various other people. And in fact, I've told my editor and my book editor and my colleagues, all we're trying to do is have people think about these concepts and start a discussion. If they say we're wrong, we're right, there's more, it's a better way to do it, or we're completely off base, good. All we're trying to do is start a conversation and see where people are, and spark some discussion, because it's better to be criticized than ignored.
That is true. What current research projects are you working on?
So that book project is the big project I'm working on, is the biggest project I'm working on. Then I'm working on some other projects with another colleague, Dr. Monique Lau. We've been using a large data set of the 2016 and then later on possibly the 2020 CMPS, the Collaborative Multiracial Politics Study. We've done a series of papers that we've sent out for review, looking at in what ways do Black folks, and I use that in a global sense, Black folks use lenses that says it's not just race that matters, but race, gender, and other things that matter in thinking through their, what public policies are of importance. And we're finding that African Americans who use, or Black people, who use more than one lens, who don't just say, well, race is the only lens that matters to me. But if they say, well, class matters to me, along with race, I mean, class as a Black person, along with race, along with gender, folk who use those more complex lens are more likely to endorse a broad number of public policies, even when they don't relate to the Black community. So that's one paper where we have a great data set and are developing. And then I have a sort of several other projects, one with Professor Juan Battle. We've created a project. I'm working with another colleague, Professor Kendall Dees. So I've got a lot of kind of important sort of projects that are sort of important secondary projects. The book project I just spoke about is the sort of main project I'm trying to finish. Not in the very near future.
Well, we would love to have all of you guys to come back and we could have a nice little discussion because that's really, really interesting. That in
Thank you.
itself, I think, would help to bring a lot of things into perspective, help people get a little bit more clarity, on how society is functioning, but then also most likely will give them an idea as to where they fit or where they stand,
Okay, right.
and can like really give them the opportunity to say, hey, do I need to do more of this, that, or do I need to just be a part of whatever's going on?
That's right.
That's not a whole lot.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And we're trying to say something really that we hope is about the state of the Black experience, the Black political experience in this early 21st century. That's with that particular book project, the first book project, or the book project I was talking about. That's what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm.
So, how do you see the role of social movements and grassroots activism evolving in today's political climate?
Well, stating it succinctly, because we college professors have the problem of not being concise, or I do. Let me not put it on all my colleagues. I would almost argue, and I don't want to go too far on a limb, but I would almost argue that Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris became president and vice president because of Black Lives Matter. Now, let me explain. I don't think you can delink the fact that more people voted in the 2020 election than have ever voted in a U.S. election ever. More people voted in that election, roughly 160 million people. We've never had 160 million people voted. And of course, more people voted for Biden than had ever voted for a presidential candidate. So why do I say Black Lives Matter or the Black Lives Matter movement mattered? More people mobilized during that protest movement than any other protest movement, we believe, including the civil rights movement in American history. One happened roughly in late May, early June of 2020. The other happened in November of 2020. I have to believe, and the social movement scholar in me has to believe, that grassroots activism and social movement activism that involves so many people across a range of communities, but particularly in the Black communities and young people, had something to do with them mobilizing, the same mobilization or the same mobilization fervor and spirit made its way to the ballot box. So that's just one example, I think, that we can say grassroots activism mattered. And even for folk who say, well, but what came of it? We do have a George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, though not passed by Congress, though short of the votes it needed in Congress. It is there for a model of a Democratic president to come and to use it as a means for police reform and to reform qualified immunity. So that's there. There have been a number of ways that local police departments and municipalities have put in place reforms that many Americans don't know about, but it was a result of Black Lives Matter that mobilization occurred. There were folk who were elected to office because of Black Lives Matter. and in state houses and in city councils and in mayoral elections because of Black Lives Matter. So there are members of Congress who were elected because of Black Lives Matter. So, election in of itself is not what activists were looking for. But sometimes what happens with grassroots movements is that there's a lag. They start a fire that burns, and later on it becomes a flame. Like the reason why so many Democrats are talking about, even Kamala Harris as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, is using the language of, well, we don't want to give all of these tax relief to billionaires. She's not just doing that because her opponent is a billionaire, Donald Trump, but that started in part from a grassroots activism of the 1% movement, the 99% movement, but then also made its way in various other ways from Black activism, asking about fair wages, fair labor, $15 minimum wage. Those things bubbled up so that, the language that Bernie Sanders used back in 2016 is now mainline language in 2024, right? Billionaires should pay their fair share. So sometimes it takes a moment for things to percolate. Hey, Rosa Parks sat down on that bus in 1955. We didn't get the Voting Rights Act till 1965. We didn't get the Civil Rights Act till 1964. So it takes a while sometimes, but sometimes activists start a fire that later on builds into a roaring flame.
So can you discuss the impact of class, gender, and age on African American group interests?
Well, I would say that if we take even the most recent presidential election, we can look at age and gender at the same time, maybe conceivably class too, and this whole discussion about whether or not young Black men are more likely to be at least persuaded to vote for Donald Trump.
I'm sorry, forgive me.
I know, and that is in fact a whole discussion, because I know you and I and others have had it, Charles. And I think that there is some of that going on, in that there are segments of young Black men in particular, not always young Black women, because there is a gender divide. There's always been a gender gap in the Black community. It's even wider now in the communities overall. Black women for the last 40 years have been voting at a little higher rates for the Democratic Party than Black men. So there's this idea that, well, this gender gap already, no, it actually goes back to the 1970s. But I think what's fueling it now, Charles, is that the young Black men of Generation Z, and maybe young Black people overall, particularly those who are not college educated, or are college educated but having to work 3 or 4 jobs, to make a living. They don't have the same structures of reinforcement that would be true for you and me. Like, they're not attending church or being pulled into the church as much. They're not joining organizations. They're not connected to various groups in the same way. And so there's not this reinforcement of this discussion in the Black community, what's in our best interest. So they're going out in the world and they'll look at TikTok, they'll go to Instagram, they'll go to, WhatsApp or whatever, and they'll get the points of view, these little points of view, if any, from that informs their view.
Those groups?
Of those groups, and particularly groups that might be not as reinforcing to say, here's the reason why you should remember what Trump did, right? And I'll just be partisan for a minute. Remember that, yeah, he might have signed a check, but Biden sent you one too. I'm not being partisan. I'm just being factual. So, and that's the reason why so I've heard Black men, that's why I'm voting for Trump. Okay, let's be factual. So there are times in which they're saying, well, the Democrats, what have they done for me? And there's not that conversation, that political space or home base I talk about, where you're having that conversation to say, well, wait a minute, brother, before you go out with that attitude, with that view, Let's have a conversation about why that might not be true. So there's not that connection that would have them. You and I have joined these men's groups where we have conversations, right? And so, we may disagree, but then we hear a counter view. I don't think they're getting the counter view, Charles. So they're going out thinking, hey, why not have this opinion? Well, there's a reason why that might not be very informed, right? And so there's that. Plus, there are ways in which this generation is not enamored because they don't have that same collective memory of, in fact, this generation now, the memory of Barack Obama is now 8 years ago.
Yeah.
So this idea, they're like, "Oh, black president." Yeah. They may not have that same memory you and I had in 2008. It's like, wow, we elected a black president.
Can you imagine 16 years ago?
16 years ago, right? If you were 18, before you even had any political consciousness. So they don't have the same reinforcing mechanisms in the communities of organizations and various things that shape you and I, and they're not having that same even point counterpoint discussion and debate in black community circles. Even at the barbershop, you might have some give and take, but you can leave there. You're not going to your other organization or this church group, or it's not reinforcing. So you go to the barbershop. I ain't gonna speak my mind because the barber disagrees with me. I'm just shut up, and then I'm gonna go hop in my car and go on TikTok. And again, that's not a forum that's going to promote. Those algorithms are just going to reinforce what you already like. And so if you have an idea that's not quite informed, it'll just reinforce your not informed idea.
Just push it way out there.
Right. And so that's how this age factor, this gender factor, can make can make a difference, and then some element of class, because if you work in 2 or 3 jobs, and yeah, inflation means a heck of a lot to you. If you are not, it means a lot to all of us. Let's be real, but it means even more when you're struggling, with high housing and rental prices. So like, what have the Democrats done in the last 4 years? So these things can bring about there's always been diverse interests in black communities, but there is even more diversity because we don't have these points to come together and to work out agreement or consensus, at least in a good way, not a consensus of you got to believe what I believe, but even to work out your differences in ways that you at least understand the counter view, even if you don't hold it. And young people are not the folk who are joining these organizations in the same ways to be able to get that reinforcing agreement.
How do you incorporate your research findings into your classroom discussion?
Well, one way I do is, and I'll just tell on myself. I make the students read some of the stuff I publish. so they may be reading. I teach a course on racial and ethnic politics, and they may be reading my intro to my Uneven Roads co-authored textbook. And that, but I think they appreciate it. I always tell my students, I like, if you ain't paying me royalties, I don't get much. But I actually do take my royalties and give them to student scholarships because I don't want to benefit from my students. That's not the point. But the idea is that I've studied this concept, so you now have the benefit of us having a good conversation based on what I've studied. And I do that all the time. In the sense of, I teach what I know. I teach what I know. I try, and if I don't know it, I try to go learn it, in order that I can teach it well. Yeah.
What are some of the most significant changes in African American politics you've observed over the past decade?
Yeah, well, I think that factor of the Black community's diversity becoming more diverse, in the sense that because the groups we look at in this book I'm talking about is, and I know these are overlapping or intersectional identities. It's these circles overlap, so they're not. You can be a Black woman and you can be middle class. It's not one or the other. But we do look at Black women, young Black people, Black working class and poor folk, Black LGBTQ folk, and Black folk with immigrant backgrounds. Those are the communities we look at. And particularly with the immigrant community, or the community with immigrant heritage, that community has always been here in America. I mean, the Black experience is one of immigration, well, importation, but immigration, with slavery. And so, in some ways, Black folk have always been diverse. If you talk about our ancestral roots in the motherland being brought here to the United States in chains, and then having to create a Black experience out of our diverse African experiences, right? You're Fulani, I'm a Khan or another group. How did we create a common Black culture together? And that's why in some ways the Black culture is so distinct and beautiful and different, because it pulls on different aspects of the African experience, combining it with the American experience to create a third experience. So to me, that diversity, particularly from the standpoint of the immigrant experience, it matters, because now it's not just since the 1980s, we've had the predominant stream of people with immigrant heritage has been from Africa. That wasn't true from 1990. More likely than not, if you go further back, you're talking about the Caribbean experience, the Afro-Caribbean experience. Mm-hmm. So to me, how do we now have this conversation when and that's why I use the term Black now, Charles, more broadly, because to me, African American connotes people who've had the experience of them or their ancestors enduring the experience of chattel slavery in the United States.
Right.
That to me is the African American experience. The Black experience is more global. Mm-hmm. Yes, you might have had the enslaved experience, or your ancestor had the enslaved experience in Jamaica. Mm-hmm. And that's what we kind of have to keep in mind, even when talking about the vice president. Is like, she she came from a father has the colonial, his ancestors had the colonial and enslaved experience, or you might have had it in, the colonial experience in Nigeria. So there's still an experience where you've dealt with sort of the Eurocentrism, white supremacy, racism, etc. But but there are these differences. And so to me, those differences, that mosaic, as one colleague by the name of Candace Watt Smith talks about, that mosaic is intriguing. And more as we talk to each other, particularly in large cities, we recognize this view, or we should recognize that the Black experience in America is now a global experience. It's Black folk from around the world, including those of Native who have nativity here in the United States. That's why I think, I'm just going to go out and say this, Charles. That's why I think it was so pernicious as to what we're doing done to Haitian Americans, or Haitian folk of Haitian immigrant experience in Springfield, Ohio. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance talking about folk eating cats and dogs. How that was so viscerally racist, but it's also viscerally racist against Blackness, because folk ain't gonna make no distinction. They can't make no distinction between being Black Haitian and being Native American, African American Black, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't open your mouth or say your last name, how do they know, right? They're just looking at a Black face, right? And so to me, that experience where we all are racialized, even though we have different ethnic views and ethnic cultures and a whole gamut of things that make us different, it's that experience of race that also is a common denominator. And so to me, that's one aspect of how Black politics and the Black experience itself is changing. And that's just one of many. I mean, if we talk about the Black LGBTQ experience over the last 20 years, and the ways in which that experience sort of lends itself to a whole range of institutions and culture, et cetera, that's been produced that has a bearing upon the African American experience. Yeah.
So, how do you stay updated with the latest developments in your field?
Well, I watch too far. I look at far too much online news and other stuff. I'm a prolific podcaster. I give a shout out to the Native Land podcast because I just like sometimes I like smart journalism. But in terms of my own field, it's not hard to do in the sense that I'm in the center of knowledge, and so I talk with colleagues, but then I certainly go to professional conferences and read, listen to presentations, read papers by smarter and younger scholars, and see the sort of the innovative stuff that they're doing. When I'm doing my own research, I have to do search. And so, I always have to be conversant. I'm always down, probably once a day, and 3 times on Sunday, I'm downloading a new article. I'm looking for a new book that I have. I was like, wow, I've been doing this stuff for a while and I didn't see this new thing. So I'm always searching, and that's why I find. And it's easy to do that when you're at a university, because that's that goes along with that's the name of the game.
Well, I know I'm not going to get to all my questions, but this is the last part of where I wanted to get some of the things that you already started talking about, your views on politics and current climate.
Okay.
Um, so what I want to know is, can you tell us what is your take on the current political climate in the United States?
Um, I I have some hope, but I also have some deep-seated concerns. I won't say fears, but I'll say deep-seated concerns. My hope is that I know I've studied the Black experience extensively in my career, and I've been privileged to understand Black political history, the at least the broad lines of our experience here as people of African descent. So I can draw upon the examples of organizations and of movements and of heroes and heroines who face challenges much greater than we face in some regard. Whether it be a Harriet Tubman during the context of slavery, or Fannie Lou Hamer and Jim Crow racism in the 1960s, who faced tougher challenges than we face, but overcame, had genius, had moxie, had courage, and got through. So I have great hope, because I have a hope relative to Black folks. I have concerns because this period is all too eerily familiar to other periods in American and world history. There is and should be a concern that all Americans have around the ugly, visceral, and I'll just call it white nationalist language coming from one of our main political parties, of centering in this idea of xenophobia, of there are people who do not belong, people who are poisoning the blood of the country. You've heard that language in Nazi Germany. You've heard that language in the worst periods of nativism in American history, and that is not good. There's the African American experience of Jim Crow following after Reconstruction, where Black folk in very large numbers were disenfranchised, had their votes taken away from them once they had gained them after the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction, using various tactics, the 8-box rule, the grandfather clause, the literacy test, using various rules to take away the right to vote. And at the end of that period of the Civil War and Reconstruction, some 1 million Black folk lost the right to vote. And that's when the Black America was roughly about 4 or 6 million, 4 to 5 million folk. So, and you have efforts in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Mississippi, in Tennessee, to restrict rights to
Alabama.
access to the ballot. Alabama, right?
Yeah.
To not only restrict access to the ballot, but to the polling place, closing down polling places. Having many fewer. In fact, there was one study that said between 2000 and the current period, some 100,000 fewer polling places are in place in the United States. So you have longer lines that discourage people from voting if they have the if they have the patience and wherewithal to go register to vote. And there's a whole attack upon the legitimacy of the vote to begin with. And so my concern is that we're in a very volatile period in American politics and in American life, and we have to be vigilant and be small d Democrats arguing for the right of everyone to vote, no matter what view you hold. Every American citizen should have the right to vote, and particularly folk of color should have the right to vote.
Now, it's just to add to some of the things that you were just saying, and I'd definitely like to get your points on this. So, here in Georgia, when that particular commission did what they did, now I have to say that even though to me, I really don't think it means much, but the Secretary of State as well as the Attorney General for the state, were against that and publicly spoke out that these folks overstepped their bounds.
Okay.
But what's going to happen with that is, the Democratic Party of Georgia, Democrats in Georgia, however that goes, they have sued them for that, and
Right.
so there's going to be a stalemate where that's not even going into effect. I think what's the larger thing is what took place in Alabama.
Okay.
And so in Alabama, they were sued by DOJ.
Right.
And so what they just did in Alabama, which a lot of those folks, as you say, a lot of people just don't stay up on what's happening. This was just a couple of weeks ago that they purged the voter roll in Alabama.
Right.
Of God knows how many people.
Right.
And so I think with what has happened with DOJ to step in and to sue them, take them to federal court, of course, which we know that means that when you're fighting against them, most likely you're not going to win. But the thing is, are they going to reinstate those people?
Right. Or do they have to or do they have to or can they re-register?
Right.
In time.
Right. So what do you think about those two places? Because I think these are the two places where you have an enormous amount of Black people here that of course a lot of people don't realize the power they have, but if they're not well versed as to these kind of things happening, what do you think the impact of that is going to be?
So I would say, Charles, that it could be let's just put it in perspective. By now, many Americans know, because this number has been reported widely and repeated, that Joseph Biden won the state of Georgia by 11,780 votes.
Right.
Donald Trump repeated it because that's the number of votes he said out loud that he wanted to find. So that's a very small margin given the millions of votes cast in Georgia. They are Biden became president of the United States based on 42,000 votes in the right places. So we're going to have very small and maybe even smaller margins of Harris-Trump that could determine the outcome of a presidential election based on the Electoral College victory. If you disenfranchise just enough folks that they could be the critical margin, then in fact, you can turn the tide of an election. In fact, there's an argument that Professor Alan Lichtman and Walter Mebane make about what happened in the 2000 election in Florida. That they both find that there were tens of thousands of African-American voters who were disenfranchised in Florida. George Bush took that state, or was granted that state by the Supreme Court, and became president of the United States. And that was a mere 700 votes, because the court said they're permitted to stop counting. Because here's one thing I want to alert your audience to, Charles. There's still work to be done on democracy in America. You might be surprised to know there is no federal guarantee of your right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. There is no federal guarantee. How do we know? Because Chief Justice John Roberts stated so. He has stated on at least one, if not two occasions, that the states determine who votes, period.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no federal law that says, now let me be clear. The 15th Amendment states you cannot, 15th, 19th, 18th, other amendments state what cannot be used to deny your vote. So the 15th Amendment says race, creed, or color cannot be used to deny your vote. But it doesn't say you can't have other things that are used to say you cannot vote, like previous condition of being incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all. So we have all of these things going on, but to get back to your point, I'm getting far afield. To get back to your point, if you disenfranchise just a small number of voters, they thought they were registered to vote, they show up at the polls and they're not,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And even if they are permitted to cast a provisional ballot, then to what degree is that? Right. And if you have an election board like the one in Georgia, they might say you can throw all those provisional ballots out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a time crunch because these votes have to be in and certified the first part of December from each of the states.
Mm-hmm.
So if, it's roughly a month you got to get them in.
Right.
So they're going to send something in and it might not be an accurate reflection of who actually voted. Right.
Yes. Yes.
So all of these things are what people have to be. And so that's why I would say to your audience, Charles, go to vote.org right now. Go to vote.org right now and see, and through vote.org, you can see if you are registered to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are not registered to vote, you can register to vote on that site. Because people in South Carolina, you have until this coming Saturday, October the 5th, as of this broadcast. You have until this Saturday to register to vote because you have to be registered 30 days before the election in order to vote. So I want to give a heads up to folks to go out there and check that now. Because you might, I'm in Alabama. Oh, I voted in the 2022 election. And yet you were purged and didn't even know it. Yes. So, we have to guard our own right to vote now as citizens. We can't leave it up to people in state government.
Yes. And final question here for you. Like I said, we weren't going to get to them all, but this is the last question I got for you. What do you think the political landscape has changed? How do you think the political landscape has changed since the Obama administration?
There are ways in which I think Obama's legacy as president of the United States is a little longer than people suspect. And I'm not saying that as a just loyal acolyte of Obama. I have my critiques of Obama's presidency as well. But I think that Obama sort of set him becoming president of the United States makes it unremarkable to some that they might vote for Kamala Harris. Now, they won't vote for Kamala Harris, and they would vote for Kamala Harris as the first woman, but the first person of color has already been elected president of the United States. Now, being the first woman of color, now that would be remarkable in some regard. But so the victory that, at least in the limited sense, the symbolic victory he had in being elected president means that the younger generation might say, well, it's not just a matter of it being a Black person or a person of color. It should be a person of color who we who represents our interest. I think that another legacy, and Obama might even admit this himself, is that Donald Trump ran because of Obama.
Yes.
You could almost link Donald Trump running to Obama insulting him playfully at the correspondence dinner.
Oh, yes.
Because he was said to have not liked that, and he said, "I'm running for president." And in some ways, Donald Trump's presidency is a backlash against Obama and the attempt of Obama, because we have these moments of backlash in American history. Reconstruction was followed by Jim Crow.
Yes.
The movement forward of Black folk being elected in record numbers under Reconstruction was then followed by the Ku Klux Klan and the widespread disenfranchisement of Black folk under Jim Crow. So we've had these periods of back and forth. The interests of Black and other folk move America forward, and then someone comes along and moves us back, right? But I think another legacy of Obama is that, in some ways, Joseph Biden is a legacy of Obama.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, other than with foreign policy and military affairs, I'm put that over to the side.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Biden has been among the most progressive presidents in American history, but I think he learned from the example of Obama's legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Kamala Harris then became the first woman and woman of color vice president because of Biden.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't say that the Biden and Obama camps have always been in agreement with each other, even with Obama out of the White House.
Mm-hmm.
That's another story.
Mm-hmm.
But I think all of this are the ups and downs of Obama's legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's much that Obama, I think, feels he wouldn't have, Obama laments that he never got immigration reform through.
Mm-hmm.
He greatly laments that. He laments that there wasn't more police and criminal justice reform under his legacy. Because remember, Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza and her co-sisters who founded Black Lives Matter, that was started under Obama.
It was.
Right? So from Michael Brown to Trayvon Martin to various other ways in which Black folk suffered under the hands of police brutality and police violence. So that started under Obama. So there are many ups and downs to Obama's legacy, but I think it's a legacy that we should be mindful of, and think about, well, where do we carry it forward, and what are the victories still to be won?
Now, I think that's a valid point. I think we can keep it as flat line, know exactly what happened, what transpired, what was passed, what was not passed, and use that to project things to go forward. But
that's right.
As we do that, though, the thing is, the people that represents either party, are they still with that or are they not? Now, I will tell you personally, I will tell you this: I'm not a Republican or a Democrat.
Okay,
I'm neither. Because
you're in the majority, actually.
But I will tell you this:
independent.
Mm-hmm. But I will say this: I know that for my interests, excuse me. I just know that there's no way I could vote for somebody that's going to repress me.
Right. Right.
And so, that's why I got to have you back on the show, because I'm going to tell you something. These black men for Trump, I want to know, did you get an invitation to that?
I did not. I think they know better than to send me an invitation.
I never got an invitation.
Okay,
so
good.
I'm just saying, is like, how do they go and they try to make us all monolithic? Like all black men. This is mainstream media. All black men are voting for Donald Trump. That's a lie.
That's a lie. The vast majority of, Charles, here's the irony. The black community is the only community in American political life where 13% of us voting for the other side is considered enormous.
Right. Exactly.
If you had 87% of white folk vote in one direction, you would say that's unanimous.
Right. Exactly.
It's like, well, that's almost unanimous. It's only 13% on the side. So to me, it's the presumption that black folk. Now the problem is that the Democrats and Republicans are not the older versions of the party where you could have these ideological and policy disagreements. You could be a black conservative and in good conscience vote as a Republican. Mm-hmm. Now, with some of the stark, ugly, nasty language and things being said by Republican candidates, including that lieutenant governor in North Carolina, it's like, how am I going to vote for that? And I'm a conservative. You got a whole bunch of people, interestingly, voting for Harris because they're like, y'all going a little far, going a little too far. So anyway, yeah.
But yes, sir. I want to thank you for your time, though, and I really hope that we could get you back on the show.
Sure, been a pleasure, sir.
Because what's happening in this climate is definitely more than just thought provoking, but is of concern for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And I really hope that in some shape, form, or fashion, we can just get this together. And people just do the right thing. So I'd like to thank all the folks that are watching on the YouTube channel. If you all will please hit the subscriptions button, hit the notifications button, and make sure you're following us for each and every show that we have. It's shows like this with Dr. Shaw that actually makes a lot of difference in the climate, not just for political climate, but also in your everyday living. We all have to think about how we live, what we do, and why we do what we do. But also remember, if you're doing something that you have to think about while you're doing it, then that means you're thinking about the consequences. So probably not. You don't want to do it. So I'd like to thank all of you again. Please join us next week as we have another set of great shows with great guests. And again, we want to thank Dr. Shaw for actually giving us a lot of knowledge today. And we'll see him back again. And thank you all and have a wonderful evening.